I was going to ask you to introduce yourself, you know, tell us your name, that kind of thing, and a little bit of background, perhaps to start, and then we'll go into it. Is that okay with you? Would you like to do it a different way?
No, that's great. I was just
Okay.
gonna wing it. Oh, wait, what's this happening on my hat? Oh, it's, never mind. That was distracting to me. I'm like, it's now that you call attention to the background, I'm like looking at everything. So this is, these are ribbons
Mm-hmm.
or direction colors, but it's all right.
Yeah, I like the hat.
Part of the hat.
Cedar.
Yeah, and it
The
also
cedar
has
people.
the eagle
Oh,
uh,
wow.
medicine wheel. It's gifted to me for some work I was doing with this land trust. Anyway, it's off topic, sorry. Okay, I'm glad you have
Okay.
questions ready because
Well, kinda. You know, I just trusted our relationship, you know, basically after the last conversation, I figured we could do it. So, could you, for the folks watching or listening, can you introduce yourself and give us a little bit of background of how you came to be involved in the work you're doing now?
sure. So I'm gonna introduce myself in our language, which is Tualashutsi. Oti Gualapu, Haf di Siaya, Haf di Ishid, Hagalitsa Sistad, Swaraps Chud, Visayan Chud, uh, Hoth Datitude. So greetings, my friends and relatives. My ancestral name is Hagalitsa. I am Swinomish and I'm Visayan. And so, good morning. I'm happy to be here. Uh, you asked me to just share a little bit about my background. I am a peacemaker. I have been formally trained by Indian Dispute Resolution Services out of Davis and Sacramento, California, back in the 90s. And then before that, I was trained by San Francisco Community Boards program at the suggestion and recommendation of my mother, who is also a peacemaker. And at that time, she was working with a group out here in Washington called the Northwest Intertribal Court System. And at that time, the um, the Judge Kuchaizi, was wanting to bring peacemaking and mediation kind of work into tribal communities. So they work with 14 different tribes to get them trained up on peacemaking skills. And so I went into that world of peacemaking because my mother said that that's what our communities needed. And at that time, I was in an undergraduate and I was just trying to figure out what to do. So while I was getting my undergraduate in um, it was basically in liberal arts with an emphasis on ethnic studies. I was also taking this peacemaking training, and it has been very transformative, you know, as a young person, and I use it still today. These peacemaking skills, and I find that oftentimes we don't get the opportunity to share who we are and to touch each other's heart through a peacemaking model because we've learned so much in the public school system how to be so competitive and how to win in any given situation. And for peacemaking, it really requires relationship building and a deeper understanding of who we are if we're going to care for one another and if we're going to care for the earth. And at the heels of my formal training, I cut my teeth as a peacemaker with two organizations, the Indigenous Women's Network and the Indigenous Environmental Network. And that's where I was not only training organizers throughout Indian country, because that's the service area that both organizations was serving. Indigenous Women's Network at that time was international, and the Indigenous Environmental Network at that time was pretty much national. It's grown up and it's gone national. But at that time, I was working with both organizations and I was actually teaching peacemaking and conflict resolution. And I was actually doing a lot of mediation internally and with our partner organizations like Greenpeace, for example.
Hmm.
And there's strong relationship with those organizations and Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace and those folks. And
Hmm.
so it's been a relationships that we've been trying to nurture and grow. But we find with every generation, there's a need to decolonize and to inform people about what it means to work in Indigenous communities if that community is on a front line, just trying to protect what is sacred, or their water or the air or the land that they have to live on. And the thing is that I marry the work of the peacemaker with the work of environmental activists. So I was in the Indigenous Environmental Network. I not only was doing that conflict resolution and facilitating a lot of conversations, often very difficult because people were not on the same page, but the good thing is that people ultimately came together, since we have had to service many different tribal communities throughout the country
Hmm.
on some pretty big issues, whether it was nuclear waste and the cleanup issues or persistent organic pollutants, all these things that were happening across the country with not only Indigenous communities, but communities of color, because oftentimes those communities are redlined into places that are pretty toxic, the environment, I mean. And so that work has strengthened my ability as an educator and as a peacemaker to bring those lessons home. So I work with our Swinomish tribal community at present as a consultant with our organization, which is the Community Engagement and Peacemaking Project. So I started that, I co-founded that with my mother and some other folks that we were able to work with throughout the years, or who went through our training program and became trainers themselves. And so it's been a wonderful experience working with my mother in my own community. We are working on the Climate Change Resilience Grant, which is a project of the Swinomish tribe. We are part of what we call the Protect Mother Earth subcommittee that reports to the Department of Environmental Protection, which is the name of the department that the grant is run through. And so our work is centered on lifting our language, our Dwalashutsi language, and teaching that to our young ones and families, with the hope that we will remember those old ancient stories and the terminology, the words, the phrases that connect us to the earth, that is our sacred obligation to protect and to ensure that we are all thriving in a way that is healthy and in a manner that is centered on wellness. And it's only because we've, as Indigenous people, have had to survive many traumas throughout the years, with smallpox during the initial colonization process, with new laws and new governing systems that were imposed upon us, using things like Robert's Rules of Order. And I was trained by a lot of elders and peacemakers that, consensus is more appropriate manner, with the tree of peace over there, the great tree of peace that the tribes over in the New York area, that would be the Oneidas and the Senecas, and many of the tribes that were from that area created a way of decision making that was very inclusive of all of those tribal groupings and families. And whenever there was a disagreement or a wrongdoing, they would gather together under a tree, and that became known as the Tree of Peace. And coincidentally, I should mention that the way that the U.S. government governing system has been structured, it follows that model. And if you think of the United Nations, for example, another entity that kind of uses that same model where you gather all the nations together and you sort of go around in a circle to talk about the important matters that need to be talked about and to discuss what is going to be the appropriate way to handle these wrongdoings or these misunderstandings or these conflicts. And so that work has followed me throughout the years. I continue to do that in my facilitation of strategic planning processes whenever there's new and different ways of doing things. And as we've been very impacted by this COVID-19 virus, there has been a great need for us as humans to change our behavior. And when you're doing that, it kind of causes a little conflict because it's a different way of knowing and being that we may not know how to adapt just yet. So there's going to be that tension. There may be some misunderstanding and disagreements about how to move forward, really. Like, did we reach herd immunity? Our, medical advisors and experts are telling us that we need to change our behavior if we're going to survive. And I think the ancient language and the teachings within that are embedded in the language that connects us to the earth are the same thing, like the CDC was trying to do when COVID came around. And, there were a lot of losses because people didn't really believe the virus even was real. Just like there's a lot of people that don't want to believe that the climate crisis is real. And so I see a lot of young ones stepping up and like getting very concerned about why the adults aren't treating this like a crisis. And I just have to say that I'm really excited about this work. So we as the Protect Mother Earth subcommittee under the Department of Environmental Protection at Swinomish is very, very dedicated at this point to raising awareness about the impacts and also about our ability to adapt, our ability to think creatively and coherently about the way forward. And a lot of us are of the same mind that the foundation of that work must be the language and place knowledge, also known as place-based knowledge in academia. And so that's what brings me here. That's a little bit about my background. I've always strived to protect the earth because I was raised in a family where my father was a farmer. He was a gardener. He was raised on a farm camp in Waipahu, Hawaii. So the Visayan part of me is that connection. I still have a lot of relatives in Hawaii. And our people here at Swinomish, we are farmers of the sea. And so the saying is, when the tide is out, the table is set. And it's looking very grim for the salmon. And we Swidops, we are people of the salmon. We are people by the water. Our elders have always said that throughout the generations. And so here we are today, and this situation is looking very bleak for the salmon, which is another indicator species for us, because all our ceremonies are centered around what gives us sustenance, like the salmon and the cedar. And so, it is, I feel, a responsibility more so than a right to hunt, fish, and gather in our usual and accustomed places, which is an article in our treaty of 1855, Point Elliott Treaty. That article number 5 says that we have the right to hunt, fish, and gather in our usual and accustomed places. And my question when I am in front of a group or a class or a workshop that's being facilitated is that possible, given the grim circumstances of the salmon today? Because
can you give us an understanding of why it's so grim? Like some of the specific impacts that have occurred that are not benefiting the ecosystem or the salmon or other species?
Sure. So we do have very strong connections to the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission, and they do have a lot of research and scientists that are working very closely with them. We also have the Skagit consortium of scientists and tribal people who live and work and pray and play around the Skagit River. And we're getting a lot of reports in. Lorraine's commission, and she is he's been a warrior for the salmon. So there's a long history of knowledge, just recent knowledge, that says that the salmon are going away because they're not able to return back up the river. There's 3 dams on the Skagit River, upriver. There are the warming of the waters. We're seeing a lot of eagles not even go halfway up the river anymore. Why? Because there's nothing up there for them to eat because they feed off the salmon at certain times of the year. And so our fisher folks, we used to be able to fish for weeks, and now it's just maybe a couple days if we're lucky, or a few days. And so that's a huge impact on our ecosystem and the food source, one of the food sources that we rely on. Our tribe is also looking at working to mitigate the clam situation, because our clams are starting to disappear or migrate away because of the changing conditions of the water and the impact. Maybe we've had storm surges, maybe the water's warm in the summer, but also disappear. And so our tribe is working with different scientific groups and has different projects going on to grow clam gardens, like they're doing up there, and some of the tribes up in British Columbia are doing. And so, it's just a matter of how we choose to adapt at this point to the ever-changing conditions.
Hey, Shelly, you're breaking up quite a bit.
As the summer's warm, all of the environment dries up, and we're seeing evidence in the wildfires that it is. Where did that start? Where do you want me to come back to? That's weird.
Oh, probably with the clams. Could you maybe log out and log back in? Just give that a try. It's okay, but if we can get it better and more consistent, it would be a good thing.
Okay, I'm gonna.
Otherwise, I can edit, but I don't want to. If we can get a good recording consistently, that would be helpful.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna log out.
So everything was good up until that point.
Okay. Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, there you are. So, yeah, let's go back to the salmon. So you were saying that the eagles don't, good, I can clear my throat while I have downtime. You were saying that the eagles are not going up the Skagit River as they used to do. And what does that indicate to you?
So that just indicates that because the salmon are not returning up the river like they once were, when there was abundance of salmon going upriver. Again, there's 3 dams that are on the Skagit River. The eagles are not flying upriver. They're staying lowland. They're staying more in the valley area where there are still salmon returning, but when they can't swim upriver, they can't spawn in their usual spawning grounds, and so hence the diminishing of the numbers of salmon. And there's different species of salmon that swim up that river. We have the fortune of having the great wealth of 5 species of salmon in one river, the Skagit River. And so that river is very precious to us. And again, the salmon is our sustenance, our SWOTOPS, people are people of the salmon. We are people by the water. Our reservation is surrounded by water. And there's a lot of inundation and a lot of warming that's happening where we have to figure out how we're going to adapt through food sovereignty programs like our clam bed, growing our clam gardens so that our clam beds can be more fruitful and perhaps survive in these kind of conditions with a little help from our science folks and our community folks to help mitigate and create an environment where the clams will thrive and not go away from us. And so we're studying, the tribe has studied the different kind of the different kind of clam garden beds and operations up in our relatives in the British Columbia area, where there are tribes that are doing that. They're growing clam gardens and they're seemingly thriving. So we have a lot to learn from each other. We have a lot of work to do. Another example is, what we're seeing evidence of this climate crisis is the forest fires, the rampant wildfires that are crossing the state of Washington even. And as I watch the news and I look at the maps of where all these fires are, most of the state of Washington has been on fire this year. I mean, half the country was on fire last year. So, the evidence is clear that when that happens, it changes your ecosystem. And we don't know what the fallout is yet, the long-term effects. We're studying it. We don't know how fast and hard the climate crisis really is going to impact, but we're seeing it happening faster than predicted. And so I'm very, very much concerned about the future and our survival in terms of feeding what we call feeding our Indian. That's access to our traditional food sources. We have a reservation that has boundaries, and there's certain 10 miles by 7 miles of reservation land, but we have our usual and custom places that we get the right to hunt, fish, and gather in. It's in our, again, treaty, 1855 Point Elliott Treaty in Article 5. It says that we have the right to hunt, fish, and gather in our usual and accustomed places. And my question, is that possible? If we have usual and accustomed places that span way beyond the reservation boundaries, up to the mountains and down south to Snohomish and up as far as the border of Whatcom County and the northern part of Whidbey Island, that's a pretty big expansive area. That's like 4 counties I just described. But anyway, our usual custom places are far reaching, and that's where we hunt and gather things. And so that's where other tribes, our neighboring tribes, do the same, because they have their usual and accustomed places. And so our treaty right says that, but that doesn't mean that's going to happen given the climate crises. And so a lot of tribes who, again, are the indicator species because they live off the earth, they live off the water. We are farmers of the sea. Some of us are farmers of the land. I'm seeing folks like the White Earth Land Recovery Project and Honor the Earth. They're buying back land. They're growing hemp. Hemp mitigates the toxins in the earth. I mean, there's all kinds of creative ways that we could look at how we're going to survive, how our future is going to thrive and survive. Perhaps we're at that point where we have to really make a concerted effort, and we can't do it alone. Our studies show that our small reservation, our small Swinomish Indian tribal community will not be able, we don't have the capacity to do it alone. We need our neighbors, and our neighbors need us, because the tide surge is not going to stop at, only impacting the reservation boundaries. As a matter of fact, the town of LaConner will be more severely impacted than our reservation. So we need each other. The thing is that transportation will be cut off between the reservation and where LaConner is. So if the means is far beyond the scope of what our tribe has the capacity for, you know, it's obvious that we need each other. We need the county, we need the townships surrounding us, we need the people that live, work, and pray on the reservation land to cooperate and to work with us. We have to strategize together because frankly we're in it together. And so that's where the peacemaking and conflict resolution skills come into play. That's also where our traditional values and the way of knowing and being on the earth come into play. So when we bring those to the forefront, we perhaps can create a deeper level of understanding and really build relationships in a powerful way that satisfies everyone to some degree as we move forward. And so I really like what these young people are doing when they say take the state to court because of the climate crises, and that they're starting to get more vocal. They're starting to become activists and taking a stand and marching and boycotting, especially in the British Columbia area. And as we see, a lot of their forest is on fire. So it's just an effort that I think as human beings, we have the responsibility to do for one another in the future, and also for our relatives that are the two-legged, the four-legged, the winged ones, the ones that we depend on. And so our climate change resilience grant is looking at our language as the foundation for the work, and that the teachings that come out of utilizing the language and the stories that come out when we work with our elders and connect them with our young people that have that energy to affect change, that is at the that those are the foundation of how we move forward. And I think that we all stand to learn from that process, from that model, which is an ancient model. And as I was saying earlier, we've never used Robert's rules necessarily as much as we've come up with processes for building the relationships and an understanding for how we mitigate or how we resolve a conflict like the climate crises.
Hmm. I was thinking about the issues and how they're kind of nested together in the public view and not very clear. For example, we talk about um, climate, we talk about environment, but you're getting to a human rights question and a health question. So
Mhm.
how do they work together, and how does your committee come to an understanding that's broader, and how can that be communicated?
Well, so like any governing system, we do have a health department and we do have an education department, culture department, and we have all these entities like any governing system. In the tribal world, they also have the cultural department that really, you know, is where the language is housed. It's where the knowledge of how we practice, like our salmon homecoming ceremonies. It's a yearly annual thing. The entire community takes part. We invite very important guests that perhaps can help us and maybe have the same vision and mission of bringing the salmon back. And we serve a lunch. Um, our fisheries folks really does a lot of work to be good hosts. And then there's that lunch is followed by a procession in which is led by our young people, and they bring the bones of the salmon to the water. We pray for the health and safety of the salmon and the fisher folks that are going out to fish, because it is kind of a dangerous occupation. And in that ceremony, we pray that the salmon will return. And we in that way, we're showing honor and respect for something that gives us our sustenance. And that is it's a ceremony. And so we have our traditional foods at ceremonial when we spread the table, call it spread the table for this meal. We want to be good hosts, and we want to serve our traditional foods. And so it's very reciprocal in that manner. And it's also very, it promotes wellness with our own people because we get to practice who we are. We get to understand why that's important. And we get to involve our elders and our young people and our entire community while informing and raising awareness with our guests. Um, they could be dignitaries, politicians, they could be educators from the neighboring school, which often, they're often there with classes. And so it's just a community-wide effort. And that's been going on for years, since I was little, I remember. And the other part of it is now with our resilience project, we want to look at how to partner our Department of Environmental Protection, our Protect Mother Earth subcommittee, with the work that the behavioral health program, it used to be called mental health, but that our behavioral health program is doing when they work on youth suicide prevention. Because we see that some of this work might help develop some confidence and some strategies for young people to perhaps use as an anchor as they move through the challenges of getting an education in a public school that doesn't really recognize who they are and their backgrounds. And so not only do they get to practice who they are, they get to strategize, they get to figure out ways moving forward in the future, given our current impacts. And there's a lot of families that have young people that are helping when they go out crabbing, for example. Right now it's crabbing season. So they get to go out and crab with their families, or they go out on the boat and fish. So that's happening. There's a lot of things to be said about these canoe journey and the canoe races that many families have participated in as a healthy activity. So this project hopes to bring the language into those arenas, working with our young people to pick up the language and also connect with the language to the earth. And so the lessons will be connected to the earth, or perhaps stories of teachings that are ancient that tell us how to behave in the world, that warn us that if we behave a certain way, perhaps we'll have a difficult time. And then it also reminds us of the sacrifices that some characters in the story made so our people today could survive. And so all of that is pretty rich knowledge. And that's what I was saying about, bringing the Lushootseed language and the place knowledge together. And so we see that as a valuable process for moving forward. And that's why, our resilience project has two efforts. One is the update to our climate change adaptation plan. The first one was completed in 2010, and now we're revisiting that plan to see what was done, lessons learned, and maybe some strategies moving forward. And then the second part of that resilience project is what we are calling the A Way Forward Toolkit. We want to figure out a way forward together. And so what our Protect Mother Earth subcommittee has done is created a strategy for working with the different departments, behavioral health, as I was saying, and their youth programs, because most of that is centered around, survival and suicide prevention, those type of things. Education, because, we would like to get into the schools, and we would like to share some of our lessons with the since time immemorial state curriculum that is mandated by school districts. So if we're going to come out with curriculum, we would like that curriculum to be accurate. We would like to inform that curriculum as Swinomish tribal members and teachers and educators that are going into the school then to work not only with our young people, but our neighbors' young ones. We're not separating it out. And then also with our culture department, because they have always been practicing who we are, whether it's in a ceremonial setting or whether it is in a youth wellness activity setting like canoe journey, dance and song practices. And and then there's of course, the Department of Environmental Protection, and that's what's sort of incubating this strategy moving forward. And so uh, that's pretty much a scenario that has played out in our community before. It seems to work, so we were going to piggyback on what works, and we're just calling it something new and different today. And we're pulling in our different resources because we have a lot of knowledge that just needs to be a little organized and maybe woven together so that, you know, we're giving the same messages and we're enriching the teachings by bringing our place knowledge and language into the classrooms or into the youth group settings. I must say that we were pretty close to losing the language, and we're bringing it back. And so there's a concerted effort there has been a thought of bringing or building up a language program at Swinomish, which is non-existent at this time. We have instructors going into the preschool, and we've had one class in the La Conner School District working with a couple different age groups, but we would like to grow that part of the work. So our culture department has been really wanting that to happen. And so we want to strengthen that piece of the work, thereby weaving our energy together. And so that's pretty much the scope of the Climate Change Resiliency Grant. Our subcommittee has been ongoing since, I want to say, 2008. So 2008, we started the Climate Change Initiative, the first round of, you know, figuring out how we are impacted by the climate and looking at what might be some of the more burning issue areas, you know, the high vulnerable areas, medium vulnerable areas, and low. And then from there, creating strategies to mitigate or adapt. And so we are now in the second phase of that, or I should say the second version. So looking at the past 12 years, lessons learned, what was completed, have the impacts changed at all? And this time around, we'd like to get input from our community. The first time around, we didn't get to do that. We got to inform our community of the impacts, but they didn't get a chance to like look at some strategies or consider some strategies. And our belief is that we be honorable in this work. And so rather than do things on the community, we would like to work with the community, hand in hand with community and sharing. There's a term that our community uses at every gathering.
It's 10 o'clock.
And it's loving, caring, and sharing. And that's a thought that was left with us from my uncle Chet Caillou. And he always spoke about how we need to be loving and caring and sharing with one another, with our guests. That's who we are. And so those are values. Those are values that hopefully we can pick up and we can pass on to the next generation. There's a Lushootseed word, it's Hachusadat. And the simplified version of that is education, but really Hachusadat is traditions of the heart. And with traditions of the heart comes compassion. But tradition of the heart means that we know what our values are and we uphold those values. And it also means that we are informed by nature and the earth around us, because that is education. That is our education. Our wealth is not the almighty dollar. Our wealth is what comes from the sea. That's our wealth. Our wealth is how we spread the table. Our wealth is how much we can give away. And so it's a real different way of knowing and being than in the Western public school kind of teaching and learning. And so that is the piece that we would like to bring in and introduce to our neighbors, and also, um, have our young people go through these experiences as families, as being connected to our elders, and start really picking up that language again. Because there are many tribes that are larger that speak pretty fluent or have fluent speakers. We do not have fluent speakers per se, but we have people that are learning to become fluent speakers today. And so that is why we prioritize that piece, because I think that there's a lot to be learned by these ancient stories, and just the terminology, which is cannot be confused. It's not the English language. And terminology is there's often embedded in that a value system that really is connected to how we survive on the earth and on the water. And it's thousands of years old. Because why? Because our ancestors had that time to study their surroundings. And it was never, ever, we were not ever of the mindset of the ego mindset that says that we are in a hierarchy manner. We are in an existence where one is above another. That never existed, because we had to work together to survive circumstances where we didn't have electricity and we didn't have cars, and it was pretty difficult actually for our ancestors to live, hence studying the earth so that they could survive on it. And we're soon to be coming to that, because we seen what happened in Texas when the grid went down, and we're seeing a lot of fires and people were having a hard time breathing. And so I'm just saying that when we learn how to survive on the earth in a traditional manner, perhaps we can thrive, because the earth can take care of herself. There's been ancient civilizations that we know about, that there's evidence, that had pretty sophisticated, technology. I would have to say that I feel like our technology is pretty sophisticated today. I could be wrong, but here we are again. It's not like we haven't been down this road, as many scientists and many archaeologists and many people who have evidence, who've studied the earth, can attest to. And that's something that I think, we have these ancient stories, and embedded in their stories are some of these things that we feel like are so, way beyond us, and part of that is intuition. The other part of it is how we be well in our environment. So when we say, living in a traditional manner, what I'm saying is we have a canoe practice. And in that practice, we have racing canoes, and then we have journey canoes. The journey canoes are much bigger. The racing canoes are slimmer, slicker, lighter, and faster. We have that technology still today. We have that knowledge. We have one longhouse in the center of our village. And the thing about longhouses is, if you think about how those were built before colonization happened, before, the 1800s, everybody had to participate, because, if you think about the wood and the logs and felling a tree and many trees to build a longhouse that is massive, where over 100 people can live, that's a lot of heavy lifting. And so not one person or 5 people, it was a community of people that worked together to put up a longhouse that people could live in during the winter, that they could, have a place to weave. They had a place to tell stories. They had a place to be warm in. And so it's that, it's not like it's actually very practical. It's very practical, living off the land. And if we have that mentality, I think perhaps, a lot of people will be able to thrive in a healthier way, given the circumstances that we're in today. And I must say that I'm really, really excited that a lot of the a lot of the women are coming forward in indigenous communities, and their voices are being amplified now because of that connection that we as women have to the earth, that we are, we birth children, we are reflections of the earth herself. We feed our children. So a lot of those kind of teachings are coming back as well. Midwifery, for example, um, all of the homeopathic medicine that's happening today, ancient. If you think about where did that come from, it's old, thousands of years old. And then we have the Western medical field. But I'm just saying that there is ancient knowledge that we can pick up and we can learn from. Like, I like to practice yoga and I like to meditate. I like to do qigong, which is ancient. Why? Because it helps me to de-stress. So I'm picking up things that are helpful. That's not to say that you have to do one thing one way all the time, because that's sort of impractical given, the ever-changing environment that we live in, because the environment is always changing. Just like as we age, we as human beings, we change. We are reflections of the earth. And so therefore, a long time ago, Carrie Dan of Western Shoshone, her and her sister ran the Dan Ranch, and they had a big strife with the federal government trying to take away their cattle and not let them be who they were. She always said, back in the 90s, she always said, the earth has a fever. The earth has a fever, and she's going to purge, because that's what you do when you have a fever. It's a no-brainer. We are of the same DNA. That's what John Trudell always says, right? We are of the same DNA of the earth. So, we have to behave as if the earth matters. And so that's a large part of the work that we are trying to do in our Protect Mother Earth subcommittee and this resilience project. And so my hope and my prayer is that it will be meaningful for our community and those that are partners to us and beyond. So we're just doing the best we can. That's all. We're just doing the best we can to remember who we are and practice who we are.
For those who don't know, the Swinomish tribe is part of a larger community of Salish peoples, and across this world, I call it the Coast Salish universe. There's been a lot of trouble and strife, and part of that has been flooding, actual, flooding of villages and so forth, like we've seen in Alaska. And there's been, political challenges around that. Can you talk a little bit about what some other tribes and villages are seeing and what hardships they're facing that are actual and physical on the ground due to climate change?
Yeah, so we have what's called the National Congress of American Indians, and it's a pretty big lobbying force of all of the indigenous communities throughout the country. And Fawn Sharp is the president, and she is also a Quinault tribal member. And the tribes on the coast, where her tribe is on the west coast, are being inundated by flooding, and there's a lot of storm surges happening, tsunami type situations that are occurring, and the land is really eroding. And so they're being forced, the whole tribe. There's little tribes, near Quinault. And those tribes are looking at plans to relocate because of, the way that the tides are sort of blowing into the land, and how the land is then eroding, kind of like the Gwich'in and the people up in the north on the Arctic, right? That their land is being impacted as well. It's eroding. It's going into the sea, and the caribou are going away. They're being impacted. Same with our salmon. So that's the ecosystems that we're all connected to by the earth and the water. And the salmon swim all the way up there and come all the way back down, up north and come all the way back down. And so if they're not making it, it impacts a lot of indigenous communities. And so we're seeing a lot of what's happening in British Columbia with the uh, there's some fish farm operations that still want to operate. So there's blockades going on up there because what happens when those kind of fish escape is they intermingle with the wild salmon. But some people call those farm salmon um, frankenfish. And there was a lot more of them back in the 90s, but as our fishery folks here, commercial fishery folks, non-native fisheries and native fisheries alike, started to see the impact of that wild salmon, the fact that they could make the flesh of that salmon any color by injecting dye to make it look real healthy and pink, as opposed to what it would look like, grayish, kind of whitish flesh, not very appetizing. And then they started having a lot of fecal matter, like smothering the below the sea. And so it started killing off all the sea life. And then there's sea lice, on and on. So when that happens, your whole ecosystem is impacted. And so there's been a big movement to shut down those fish farms around here. And we had a big escape off of Cypress Island. So Lummi, Swinomish, all these tribes came up and they started trying to get all that farm salmon out of the water, because what it does is it intermingles, like I said, and then you have another kind of species, I guess. So those are the kind of impacts that we're seeing, as well as, the Burrard swelled-tooth nation up there in British Columbia. They're very concerned about their waterway, and it's very, very slim channel that these big oil tankers and other cargo ships go through, and there's a lot of ships that go through there, and it's really impacting their sea life and their ability to practice who they are. And so they're protesting up there, and on top of that, they have that Trans Mountain pipeline coming through, and it's not unlike what we're seeing on the Mississippi. But that pipeline happens to have oil that would feed into the reservation's stolen land, which is called March Point, where two oil refineries are located on the north end of our reservation. And how that happened wasn't by agreement by the tribe, of course. At that time, Ulysses Grant signed a proclamation. Well, it was an executive order that said that, this is really he demarked a map of the reservation, and he cut off March Point, that tip that goes way out into the bay. And he claimed that that was not reservation land. And now today, industry has been built on there. There's two oil refineries that have been on there for a while. And our shellfish is poisoned out there. So we know that not to go gather shellfish out there. And
Well,
so that's the circumstances. It's just on and on. I can go on, give you a lot of different examples, but that is the reality that we're faced with. That's why we have to educate one another, work together, because it's not just impacting us anymore. That refinery is not just impacting us anymore. There's going to be more oil tankers coming through? Not a good idea. Tribes around here don't think that's a good idea.
well, the word on the street about the oil industry is where there is oil, there will be spills.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that came up at Standing Rock and with Dakota Access Pipeline and Keystone XL and Trans Mountain
Yep.
and the protests that are occurring in British Columbia at Wet'suwet'en to block, the pipeline. So there's a major effort going on, politically and culturally that's in the news. And I can't believe Facebook, how many people are committed and working and protesting.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like a large movement. Does that surprise you that suddenly there's this presence of the care and concern you're talking about in a real
Mm-hmm.
world circumstance that's quite difficult, as far as negotiating with these companies
Mm-hmm.
or the
Yeah.
or the regional territorial provincial governments, state governments.
Mm-hmm. It's hopeful. It's hopeful. I'm hoping that with that surge that things can change really, but I'm of the mindset that if we don't stop things now and change our behavior, and some people will say, well, we're so addicted to oil that can never happen, that we have to take our time. But we already know that the earth will continue heating, and the more we develop fossil fuel industry and use that um, addiction, then we are pretty much sitting ducks. And I really feel that there's a lot of sweet deals that are being made, a lot of things that sound green and good and um, renewable, but the earth, I feel like the earth should have rights, and that this next generation are exerting their rights by suing the state, for example, brave young souls that are suing the state. And of course, there's a lot of uh, legal beagles that are supporting that work as well. And so that is promising. When we have legal entities that are willing to defend the earth, and I'm talking about, it comes from that book, Earth Jurisprudence, but I'm also talking about those lobbying, environmental legal lobbying groups that are really fighting hard to litigate matters of wrongdoing. And so that's the more extreme than sort of mediating and developing strategies for mitigation. It's really, a win-lose kind of situation. And I really feel that the fossil fuel industry has put us there. We're in a win-lose situation, and we can take our time and let the earth continue to warm and hope and pray, or we can stop our behavior like we did with this coronavirus. I think that virus had a lot to teach us about how we might be able to adapt better and more emergent. But I don't know, like there's a lot of naysayers still who didn't believe that the virus even exists. Just like there's a lot of people that want to say that there is not a climate crisis. But I like what Gora was saying in Inconvenient Truth. It's certainly inconvenient for a lot of people that don't want to look at it. But we need more people to be brave enough to look at it and to actually do something rather than sit on the fence and wait for someone else to do it, because it's only our future at stake. So I'm of the mindset that it is a crisis and we have to stop bad behavior now, and we have to start mitigating in a clear and coherent manner so that we can all survive. Thomas Binyaka talked about this many years ago, the Hopi Survival Kit. That's what that book is. If we read that, there's some knowledge in there.
Well, it's pretty amazing to be alive in these days because we have all these things that are going on, like the protests and the reclamation of language and identity and relationship to the land and those kinds of things, and the public protests. But at the same time, just down the road, you have 121-degree temperatures in British Columbia and whole towns bursting into flame.
Yep.
And the relationships seem to be expressible scientifically, that in terms of probability, and temperature rise and things like that, that it isn't a direct line, but there's a circumstantial relationship.
Mm-hmm. I'm just hoping that tribes aren't divided by, what would be the best strategy moving forward. My hope and my prayer is that we, as in the indicator species, will take action for the benefit of not only the future, but those indigenous people that are south of us that are being impacted now because of our convenient ability to drive a car or fly a plane or transport something, because it's costing them their lives and their livelihood now, today. Massive communities have been impacted by the oil industry. Look at Nigeria. One of the elders there one time was sharing a story about that, how they have these huge oil operations that light up the skyline in and around their villages. It's so bright and it's so much like a
Can you
lit
start that again?
environment.
Because I had my phone went off. So in Nigeria, what do
Yes.
we see?
So in Nigeria, um, one of the elders shared the story that it's changed their way of life. And how it's changed their way of life is that they used to be able to go around in these villages as a way of resolving conflict. They used to be able to go around and knock at the door and sing these ancient songs by way of spotlighting a wrongdoing and going to that person that did the wrongdoing to their relatives' homes and doing this. And then it was a peacemaking process. But when they built those huge shell oil operations there next to these villages, uh, if you see any kind of oil refinery, you'll see that they have lights on 24/7. They never go off. And so to them in Nigeria, it was daylight all the time. It's like when you live in Alaska and it stays daylight all, it was like that. So that ritual and that way of knowing and being in terms of your values around how you treat a wrongdoing, that was no longer. They couldn't do that because it never got dark. It had to be in the cloak of darkness. And so it
Uh,
changes a way of life because when you can't go out in the cloak of darkness and practice a ritual around a wrongdoing and have some kind of resolve by that person's family, then you are having to modify a way of life, and that dispute resolution strategy goes away. You have to do something else. And so it changes a culture's behavior and it changes the culture's food source, even when you have these kind of things happening. And here we are in the land of the privilege, and we can take our time maybe, and we can wait and see what's right. But while, indigenous people in another continent or south of us, or even north on the Arctic are being impacted now. Their livelihoods, their homelands are going in the water. But we can, so I'm of the mindset that we have to change our behavior now and we have to lock arms together and stop pretending like we can't do it.
right. Well, activists were killed in Nigeria, right? I forgot the gentleman's name that was very famous and, was
Mm-hmm.
met a very untimely end. And about that time, I was reading also about Ecuador
Mm-hmm.
and the Ashwar people and the Warani people and how their lands had been polluted with oil and
Mm-hmm.
the rivers had been polluted and so forth. And those were places for, sustenance and food supply and
Right.
uh, community well-being. And there's a certain amount of that in Alaska, but there's a number of problems in Alaska in the villages, and one of them is sewage.
Mm-hmm.
There's no sewage system. There's no pollution control sometimes, or if if pollution is released into a river or stream, it's not necessarily uh, addressed. It can be mitigated in other ways rather than, say, stopped or removed or those kinds of things. And so,
Mm-hmm.
from the research on this series of podcasts, it's been appalling to me how the conditions seem to be deteriorating in the Bering Sea villages.
Mm-hmm.
And traditional hunting and fishing get more difficult. The ice pack is melting.
Mm-hmm.
The ice pack protects the shoreline from erosion and destruction, and the permafrost. Our
Mm-hmm.
industrial facilities, even the oil facilities are, leaning and falling over and breaking and spilling oil and these kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
And so it seems like that's another part of the crisis, but from a human rights perspective, it's appalling.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's this other movement happening today, and it's really heartening that young people are taking to the streets, and there is a resurgence of movement happening. Standing Rock being one of the drivers, I think, to show people that, hey, we can do this. You can come and help. You know, it's going to be hard perhaps, but, you know, standing together, we're stronger in numbers. And the fact of the matter is that that's how change happens over time. You know, Martin Luther King and all of the marches and protests he did, and then, you know, Billy Frank Jr. and all the fishing wars that were happening. It's just another iteration.
Hmm.
And what's causing alarm, I think, is because of the fires, and is because people are talking about the salmon going away, and people are getting educated. And here in the state of Washington, some schools are actually, you know, trying their best to partner with tribes and find out what the issues are, and find out how can we have you come and speak in our science class, or how can we have you come and talk to our young people about this climate issue, or the cultural ways of knowing and being and how we should behave in the world. And it's with that kind of energy, it's with that kind of education that we can pull together. We are also lifting on a term that comes from a story of pushing up the sky, and the term is Yahau. In the shoot seed, it's Yahau, and Yahau means to lift together. And so we're bringing those kind of words out in our language to show the way forward, because that that story that comes with that word, that where that word is highlighted, is about people who are different and speak different languages, walking around in a world where the sky was too low and bumping their heads on it, but they had no way to communicate with one another because they all spoke different languages. But then one day, the one of the elders came and said, in the elders council, they called to seek advice on what to do. So we'll have a word. It'll be your how to proceed forward together. We'll say that word at a certain time, at a certain place, and we'll all lift together our shaved poles from those long time ago. They used to be really tall trees. We'll shave them into poles, and then we'll lift together, and that's that, yeah, how. And that's kind of example of a story I was talking about earlier, where there's a lot of wisdom there, and you don't have to overthink it. It's practical pretty practical how we survive on the earth together. And that's what we're hoping to teach the young generation now, like how to pick some of that knowledge up, because they're going to have to work together. It's beyond our tribe's means to mitigate this situation, quite honestly. We don't
Hmm.
have a choice.
We have a group in New York City that I've been participating in, which is at City University of New York and Hunter College, and some lovely people, educators who are very concerned about the environment. It's the Department of Environmental Science. And so we bring up these issues, and I tell some of these stories. And this podcast will be seen there. But one of the comments from a founder that I heard yesterday was, in New York, people aren't thinking about this at all.
Hmm.
And yet, I mean, New York City, Brooklyn, perhaps that person meant. I'm not thinking about upstate New York and the Haudenosaunee and the tribal communities where there is, that awareness. But in our ordinary lives, in our big cities, in our media centers, the number one media center of the United States, right? New York City. There's sometimes a disconnect between people's lives and lives that are connected to the earth.
Mm-hmm.
Not always, but sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And it's prevalent.
Mm-hmm.
So I think some of the stories that you've provided are a good way um, to educate, in a heartfelt way. Is there anything else that you could say or that you would like to communicate to our big city brothers and sisters to encourage them?
Well, when you say that, I think of back in the 90s, I met this elder from Iceland. Is it Iceland? And he was from a village up there, and he was going around the globe, he's going around the earth, and he was talking about this prophecy. And what he said was that one day he's going to be, that culture he comes from is canoe culture, also like us. We're surrounded by water here. We're in the Pacific Northwest. We're on the coast. Well, he's surrounded. He's on an island, like my relatives in Hawaii. They're on islands, so they kind of see it more, and they're experiencing it more immediate. And he was saying that one day he would be paddling down Fifth Avenue in New York. He would paddling down Fifth Avenue, and it would be like 5 stories high. And so I think that that's a real simplified version or way of thinking about what's to come. And we see a lot of earthquakes happening. We see, the flooding that's happening even now today in certain parts of the country, east and south, and they're getting more intense. And when we talk about power, it's not political. When we talk about power, it's not this grid that provides our energy. When we talk about power, it really is the water and the wind and the waves and the thunder and the lightning. That's power. And so when I talk about the earth, purging because she has a fever, that's what I'm talking about. Our dilemma is, will we be able to handle that purge together? And what does that look like, really? Can we minimize it? That's a big question mark. It depends on herd community mentality, I guess.
Well, a few years ago, we both probably knew about or participated in something pretty wonderful that happened on the Olympic Peninsula. And that was, the restoration of the Elwha River, the beginning of the restoration anyway, which had been dammed, 100 years ago. And it was a tribal river with villages upstream and hunting and fishing upstream. And it cut off the food supply for 100 years. So to my mind, that was a genocidal act.
Yes.
And that was what drew me to Washington and to Coast Salish peoples, and a lot of learning that has taken place for me personally. But in working on that and making a film, it occurred to me that this idea of respecting the natural processes and letting nature alone to do what nature does best, and even removing infrastructure, which was said to be impossible at the time, politically impossible. And how could you remove all that concrete? It's a very similar argument to the oil industry question. Do those refineries need to be there, and do we need to continue to use and pollute, to the degree, that has been occurring? Did you feel that that was a signpost or a way forward, in a sense, toward learning? And what can we learn? I mean, internationally, really, it's never been done anywhere else. That's the largest ecosystem restoration project that's actually been completed in the world. Or it hasn't been completed, but it's been, the Everglades was not, the Everglades has other problems, and that was, a similar situation of a necessary restoration. But those dams are out on the Elwha, and the fish are returning up above where the dams used to be. And there were 11 stocks of anadromous fish in that river.
Yeah, I would have to say that that would be a benefit to all of us if we got the 3 dams off the Skagit and all rivers across the world. It would just be a little inconvenient, with regard to electricity. But, when we say that we have ideas that support green renewable energy, really, green renewable energy like solar, perhaps wind, growing hemp, those kind of ideas, that more could be invested in that kind of strategy, and that we take a real serious look at what it means to keep extracting fossil fuel, which is one of the number one drivers, transportation. That's what I'm talking about. One of the number one drivers. And so when we say we need to change our behavior, we already know the science tells us the earth is going to keep warming, even if we stopped. So thinking practical would be helpful as a human species, but we like to compartmentalize, break things down, separate, silo, and then pretty soon everyone's in conflict. Just like that story I told. We have to stop doing that. We have to stop putting price tags on minute things that separate us. And we have to stop dangling that big carrot and saying, we know that you guys are fighting for bones anyway, that you're just barely surviving and able to, practice who you are. And there's a lot of communities in the South, I must say, that can't even do that, right? At least we kind of, are at some tables. Be nice to be at the state table more, in a more respectful and honorable way. But I'm just saying, there's a difference between working with the federal government and the state government, and then there's the county, and then all of that, right? Very confusing, very schizophrenic. So when we talk about what is the way forward, it's real practical. We hang on to those ancient knowledges, and we bring our language back that connects us to our values of how we treat one another. Kuchusida.
Well, there are a lot of laws that exist that are commonly not followed, and some are very important laws, like the National Environmental Protection Act, NEPA, which doesn't really have much standing with the judges in the courts. And although it's a principal law that was enacted in 1965, actually by Richard Nixon, of all people, along with the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, because of the political awareness that was growing at that time, but also ARFA, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act,
Right.
NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Repatriation Act, and several more that are commonly ignored. And one of the pieces of evidence of that ignorance has been a failure to consult with tribes on industrial and governmental initiatives. I wrote something once about confusing contact with consultation. That often it goes in the public records that contact has been made, and they pass that off as consultation, even if no one answered the phone. If they call up on the phone and no one answered, they've attempted contact, right? So that can be used, to satisfy certain requirements as far as industrial projects being built. And then there's the question of consent, contact as opposed to consent. So consent being, did you really talk to people, and are they in agreement, and are we working together?
Yes, that is where we're at today as Swinomish and other tribes in this region, which is where the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indian happens, in this northwestern region of the country. And there's a lot to be said about consent versus consultation. And I think we are far beyond consultation because of what you just said. So yeah, so tribes are looking at, just like everyone looks at, oh, well, did you do an environmental impact assessment before you started building? And we see a lot of that not happening. So we're still in the same boat pretty much, and we're just asking for now more. Like when we rolled out the Since Time Immemorial curriculum here in Washington State, so that was through the Department of, well, it's now called the Office of Native Education, right? And a guy by the name of Denny Hurtado, a former chairman at Skokomish, he was part of this force. He was working for the Office of Native Education and really wanting to get the Since Time Immemorial curriculum into the schools. So the school students would learn about their neighbors, the natives, in whatever, county or town they lived in. If there was if they were in the vicinity of natives, they should learn about them. That's all. That's the since time immemorial curriculum. And at the time that it was rolled out many years ago, it was just strongly encouraged that school districts are strongly encouraged to pick up this curriculum, and the vast majority didn't. This is a state law. And so Senator John McCoy comes around of Tulalip and he puts in mandatory instead of strongly encouraged. So it's like that. So more school districts are beginning to do it, but the majority are not yet. They haven't figured it out yet. So there's a lot of work to be done still. Just because we have a law doesn't mean that people are going to follow it. That's what I'm trying to say.
And that's kind of weird, that we have a law in the books of the United States of America and they're ignored continuously over and over and over again. So, we discussed my film in Southern California on the fast tracking of large solar in the deserts, and how that was thought of and supported by groups like the National Resources Defense Council and the Sierra Club to some degree as a green energy solution. But why aren't those solar panels on the rooftops where they're used, and why are there transmission lines for 200 miles built across native lands and villages and cremations, destroying ecosystems and so forth? That's not green. And the carbon footprint involved in shipping steel products and solar panels from China is not green. And I think gradually I saw a softening, on behalf of the typical environmental groups toward, taking into account, native views and taking into account the fact that everything that's gold is not green, or everything that's green is not gold, or you know what I'm trying to say. Everything that's green is not sustainable.
Yeah, that's right. Well, here's one thing that a golden nugget, I guess you could say, that I want to leave. And that is that we have to remember that we stand on the shoulders of giants. We stand on the shoulders of a lot of activists, leaders, strategists, cultural knowledge keepers. And back in the early 90s, there was this document that was drafted, and people like to conveniently forget or invent something new, but it was called the Principles of Environmental Justice. Early 90s, down in Rio. That's when it was created. And it wasn't created with the mainstream environmentalists like the Sierra Clubs. They weren't at the table. The people of color, indigenous people, had to create their own forum because they were kind of locked out of that when, that whole Rio situation happened. And so I just bringing it up because it's a tool that I use today. It's called the Principles of Environmental Justice. Then 20 years later, in 2000, early 2000, I went into Washington, D.C. at the second People of Color and Indigenous People Environmental Leadership Summit. So, there were hundreds of people there, hundreds of people in Washington, D.C., people of color, Native people. And I must say that there was another document that our working group, there were 3 working groups, ours was one, and ours was to produce what's called the Principles of Working Together. So I had the honor to facilitate that, to co-facilitate that so I was with the Indigenous Environmental Network, and the Asian Pacific Environmental Network was the partner organization that helped facilitate that conversation. And we did come out with a working document, and we delivered. The 2 other work groups did not, but we did. And there is, if you Google search both of those documents, the Principles of Working Together, in the preamble is the preamble for the principles of environmental justice. So the work just continues. And maybe we need to do another iteration of that. I don't know. But it really spells out very clearly that the grassroots folks, the most disenfranchised, those are there on the front line of those communities that you just talked about, that we speak for ourselves. And there's clear guidelines of what that means. And there's even, a section that is about decision making. So it's really wonderful. I don't like to overthink things too much.
Yep.
I don't like to reinvent things unless, I can improve upon them or I can modify them for a community, because I'm a facilitator. I facilitate a lot of groups around these kind of issues. But I just have to say that, the more transparent we are and the more relationship building that can happen, that is creating understanding between one another, the better position we will be in to live together. But we have to pay attention to these women, what the women are saying, and we have to be paying attention to what the earth is showing us, especially following the coronavirus pandemic situation. We are in the throes of that right now. But I'm just saying, following that first year, there's a lot of lessons that came out.
Thank you, Shelly. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I hope that people take heart and listen with their heart.
Yes, Huchusadan. Traditions of the heart. That's what we need more of.
Yeah, so that's our official ending, I guess. And, I just wanted to chill with you a little bit. I have, there's going to be a seminar in the fall in New York, which
Can I just end it with a traditional ending?
Oh, yes, of course.
Okay, so I just want to say, Asbubulachi, Bitabutlached. I raise my hands to all of you who are listening, who are taking the time to really think in a clear and coherent manner about the way forward, and that we can pull together because the future needs us to. Thank you.
That's a better ending.
Okay, what were you saying?
Thanks for the help.
Yeah.
I kind of think journalistically, because I'm in this world, of so many voices that are kind of wrong, and I want to, I want to use the Western method, of like breaking this down. Let's break it down, right?
Yeah.
But it's not always the best way to do it.
So you were saying about an event that's happening in New York?
Yeah, they've agreed at the university, at City University of New York, to create a seminar, or not a seminar, a conference. And right now they're calling it a mini conference, but I said, why is it a mini conference? This should be a conference.
Yeah.
And we should be promoting, and this is the #1 media market. And I do know something about PR, and maybe I can help there, and maybe we can find a publicist, who can really, with 20 years experience, calling, media, with those relationships in place. And that's the way that you really get attention, in the press. So I think all that can happen, and I'm willing to work on that, with you. I'd really love your help, and your participation. And I talked to Patrick Anderson about this as well in Alaska. He's with Rural CAP, so he knows the villages very well, and the hardships in the villages.
Oh, good. Yeah.
So I think, looking at just the people that have been a part of these podcasts, it would be great to combine efforts where we can, to participate in these forums. So if we can talk more about it, but I wanted to let you know about that.
Yeah, I think that follows the vein of we have to figure out ways to work together. And I think one of the things that this COVID-19 shows us is that we can actually do things virtually and get a lot done.
Right.
And, any traditionalists will say we should gather in person and this and that, but we are in an emergent situation. We have to adapt. And while we have it, we might as well use it. Just saying.
Well, it was pretty amazing to me with regard to Standing Rock that tribal people seem to invent a whole new way of organizing and communicating online, and
Yes.
spanning wide territories and interest groups and, the veterans and the students
Yes.
and just, the veterans, that was so touching to me because of you know, the way that Native communities have supported the armed forces of the United States of America, with their participation
Hmm.
and so on, and so it was wonderful to see veterans coming to Standing Rock and saying, brothers and sisters, we're with you in you know, the
Hmm.
figurative battle, and um, anyway, that was stunning to me that that happened.
Yes, that's pretty powerful. That's power too, when you can transform. That's the other
Mhm.
thing that we need to see is how do we just transition? How do we do that
Yeah.
honorably? That we need these kind of skills. We need to pay attention to the principles of working together. We need to, what does honor mean to each other? We have to have those kind of conversations. That's where the trust starts coming into play. If we don't trust one another, it can't happen.
Hmm.
And then, the future is screwed. But I don't know, for those that have those that have grandchildren or maybe children, it kind of gets personal, I
It
mean,
does.
we have to go to that place and be willing to feel it. A lot of people don't want to do that.
Is that what ego does? Cuts us off?
Because we're not really paying attention to what the animals are teaching us. Animals don't really fight amongst each other unless, of course, you're, one of those. What are those insects where when they make love and the female bites the head off?
Oh, the Black Widow? Yeah.
Well, there are some. I'm not talking about those ones. Okay, I think we're done
You
talking.
think we're done now?
Oh, I'm just saying nature has a lot to teach us.
Yeah.
That'll come back to me. I forgot what that is called. But when I use that, um, and it's like the difference between when I was at Indian Dispute Resolution Services, the director he was an Orthodox Jew. He was a twin. He was from New York. He taught at Columbia, and he was a really, very intelligent man. And he brought us Indians together. He used to do this exercise where you choose an animal, at the beginning. It's like an icebreaker, and you
Mm.
tell people why you chose that animal. You tell people choosing the bear and the eagle and all these like honorable, and I chose a dinosaur. So he started laughing at me, and he said, "Oh, do you feel, ancient? Do you feel like extinct?" And I said, "No, that's my, I have a 3-year-old nephew, and I'm real close to him, and he loves dinosaurs, and I miss home." And so
Hmm.
it really is, it's a real difference of looking at things. And if you honor another person rather than being sarcastic and literal, they might tell you a story that you might appreciate. And then he was also the one that always told me, Shelley, I'm surprised that you didn't pick a fly. And I said, well, fly? Why would I pick a fly? And he said, because you're always attracted to crap, like as a mediator. And I said, and so I shared that with my best friend Neelock Butler, who's one of the fiercest, honorable, and I often had to mediate between her and the other mainstream environmentalists. Um, she said, "No, Shelley, you're not like a fly. I think you would be more a dung beetle." And I was a lot younger back then, and I didn't know what that was. But she was world traveled and everything, and she said, "You know what a dung beetle does is they go and they take the crap and recycle it, and then
Yeah.
beautiful things grow."
Yeah.
And I like that a lot better. So I always tell that story now because it is a difference. It's based on perception and experience. And if we
Perspective.
can, yeah, if we can honor each other's historical trauma, that's where the relationship building starts.
Right.
Because we all have trauma. We can't get away from it. We're humans. It's part of the nature. It's what Buddhists say. They say life is about suffering. Duh. You know what I'm
Mhm.
saying? It's like, let's not overthink things. It's just getting back to Chusada, traditions of the heart, because we're all in this together. You know what I'm saying? That's
Yeah.
it's not difficult. We just have to be a little bit more compassionate. And that's what the Dalai Lama always says.
Yeah, I'm listening to the
One of
Dalai
my
Lama a
heroes.
lot these days. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, Dalai Lama, he's on Facebook again. Right on. I'll
Yeah.
drop everything I'm doing, and
Yeah.
it's I don't know. I get
So
it.
those elements, I bring that Buddhism because my father was a Buddhist. He's
Oh
first
yeah.
generation Hawaiian Filipino, right? So the Filipino, and when they were colonized, there's a lot of Catholicism and Christianity, but then the other part, the southern part, is Buddhist, right? But he always
Right.
practiced that. He didn't go to a temple. That's just the way he was. He lived off the land. He lived off the water, and he practiced Buddhism. He had all these books about Buddhism, and so that's where that comes from when I use those kind of
Uh-huh.
teachings, because there's a lot of ancient teachings that come out of that world too.
It's not so different.
Yeah, I'm part Filipino.
Yeah.
I'm what they call, my uncle has a term of endearment that he's coined. My late uncle. It's called Indopino, which is a combination of Indian and Filipino.
Yeah. Cool.
So you hear that a lot up here.
Yeah.
There's large pockets of Indopino families. Filipinos married, when they came over and they started farming. They married in the berry fields, in the hop fields. They married indigenous women. So there's a whole population up here,
Hmm.
Filipinos. We just happen to belong to tribes.
Yeah.
So I just know that's a whole new like culture, isn't it? It is, because we eat adobo, chicken adobo, and we eat salmon,
Yes.
smoked salmon. Yum.
Yeah.
But anyway, so that's that. I just leave you with that. Now I'm
Yeah, we're
really
all
hungry.
connected in a lot of ways. It's pretty amazing. I mean,
Yeah.
my dad, I mean, he wasn't indigenous, he was Swedish, but the old traditions, the things he would do and not do, and the things he would teach and not teach, and what he wanted for me in my education were very old.
Nice. That's the way
It
I feel
wasn't
like
like
the
modern
Dutch.
stuff.
The Dutch are a lot like that too.
Hmm.
I mean, I have Dutch friends that just phenomenal that what they know about the earth, and they're growing their own stuff, and oh
Yeah.
wow, I'm just so blown away. And it's that indigenous knowledge that they're tapping into that they never forgot.
Yeah, there's pockets of that. They keep just doing it because they're stubborn.
Yeah, that
Yeah, this
too.
is what we do.
Johan. His name is Johan too. Does that sound Dutch or what? He's a good buddy. I just love that guy. He's the best gardener. He's like, man, I'm so impressed.
Oh,
That's
that's
how
cool.
I felt when I went to Jamaica too. All the men, they knew every plant. They knew how to
Right,
prepare it. I mean, like Ital, the Ital diet is not different than kosher. Every
right.
culture has it. So it's pretty cool. But it's good talking with you.
Yeah, thanks for your time. I really appreciate it. And let's talk again soon. I'd like to, kind of get organized a little bit around the podcast and what we can do, with some of this or take it to the next level or something. So,
I would love that. And as you
okay,
know, we're
cool.
developing our way forward toolkit, and I would like to take maybe
Right.
segments too, if whatever you share, like pull it into our toolkit. That would be really cool.
Right. Well, I was talking to, Patrick in Alaska, and he, like I said, he's really well educated. He went to Princeton. He's Tlingit native,
Oh, nice.
and he been running these corporations and everything. But he said, I really don't understand the creative communications part. How to
Oh,
do, I mean, some of the things that you've said, how to visualize the story.
oh, I see.
Like remember the way
Mhm.
you talked about the canoe going up Fifth Avenue.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
Mhm.
that's creative.
Yeah,
That's
it
that's a
is.
way to stick something in somebody's brain. So they're,
Yeah. Why?
and so
I
I'm
live
I'm
on
kind of
Fifth
working with
Avenue.
Patrick.
Yeah. I work on Fifth Avenue. Suddenly it becomes important.
Yeah.
Yeah, when they
So
hear
I
that
think,
story, they're going to have a reaction for sure. If you can catch their attention, that's the key.
yeah, maybe I'll start with that in the podcast.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good, strong metaphor.